We were hoping that well, anyway, let's get going. Okay, my name is Andrew McLaughlin. This is the final panel of the day, so I'm sure everybody's energy levels are incredibly high. But the good news is we have a real barn burner of a panel. The idea that we've set out for this discussion is to take a step back and to think in a little bit broader terms about the effect that the technologies that we're all here to focus on have had on democracy, free speech, and the nature of the societies that we live in. I think it's fair to say that we live at a moment right now where the dark undercurrent of harassment, abuse, racism, the atomization of individuals, the extremism and decay of democratic practice that we see around us is at least coinciding with the rise of these technologies. And so for those of us that have been optimists, some of us that have been more pessimistic, it's a moment to take stock and also to try to think about what the future may hold. So we have assembled a super interesting panel. What I'm going to do is ask John Ralston Saul to start us off with his thoughts, and then we're going to have a sort of actively moderated conversation among the panelists. It's an Access RightsCon sort of tradition that we don't do intros, because you can go online and look up everybody. But just to situate folks, and ask everybody just to say a sentence or two about what you do and where you're from, and then John, over to you, and then we'll have our conversation. And everybody can have a mic, actually. There's mics for everybody. So, John, could you just say a few words about yourself, and then we'll go to your talk after.
So I'm, until 18 months ago, I was for 6 years the elected international president of PEN International, the oldest civil society organization in the world, 1921. It's the original defender of freedom of expression in modern terms. And I'm now also the co-chair of something called the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. But above all, I'm a writer, books like Voltaire's Bastards, The Collapse of Globalism, Unconscious Civilization.
I'm Paul Nemitz. I'm in the European Commission, the Director for Fundamental Rights, so civil liberties and rule of law, citizenship, democracy issues. And I'm also a visiting professor of law at the College of Europe. That's my background.
My name is Mariam Khawaja. I'm the Special Advisor on Advocacy for the Gulf Center for Human Rights, and obviously the only woman on this panel.
It's definitely a tough one to follow up on. I'm another one of the gentlemen, but happy to be sitting next to you. Thank you. I'm Stephen Turner. I'm the head of public policy for Belgium for Twitter, so known as the Brussels guy for Twitter. And before that, working in public policy on digital issues for many years here in Brussels. So.
All right, over to you, John.
So I've been asked to speak for 15 minutes, so that's why I've got some notes, because I literally got off the plane from Toronto an hour ago, and a day before that I got off the plane from the high Arctic, where it was minus 52. So I'm in a slightly confused state. That's all right. Look, I'm going to do something very general. In the lead up to the Second World War, IBM was very close to the Nazi Party. The Holroyd counting machine, which was the first stage towards the computer, which I suppose you could say was the stage towards the internet, the Holroyd counting machine was used by IBM to support the Nazi organization of the Holocaust, both the rounding up of the Jews and then the running of the camps. And orders were then given to the American Army to, as they liberated the camps, the ones they liberated, to seize the Holroyd counting machines and give them to IBM, at which point they were used for, I don't know, healthcare, education, whatever. It's all in Edwin Black's book, for those of you who, I didn't make this up. The point of the story is very simple. Technology has absolutely no ethical content. It has absolutely no purpose of its own. And when you were talking about the optimism, the problem of the optimism was there was a wonderful moment when people actually believed that communications technology had a purpose and an ethical purpose and could lead automatically to something because of that purpose. Secondly, even though we're moving towards some kind of artificial intelligence technology, and we all know what it is, still remains, and I say this as a writer who writes about these things, still remains deeply linear. And that linearity has an additional impact in terms of the difficulty of it having a direction of its own. And to pretend that it has any purpose makes one slip into dangerous territory, the ideal of the borderless disinterest, as opposed to borderless self-interest. And I think that kind of idealism lasted long enough to open doors to interest groups, whether they be governments, security forces, or large corporations. I think there's actually a line that the people with ethical standards believed so much in the technology that they weren't watching while government, security forces, and large corporations were occupying the space of actual power. I say this, as I said at the beginning, as a former president of PEN International, and I just want, PEN's a strange, strange body, but it was, having talked about IBM and Holroyd counting machine, it was PEN that in 1933 was the first international organization to take a strong stand against the Nazis at a famous international gathering in Dubrovnik when the German PEN Center was ejected. It was an incredibly moving and dramatic moment. And of the other international organizations, as you know, waited until 38, 39 to take a stand. So it's an organization, 155 PEN centers in 122 countries. And I say this to you because this period of incredible breakthrough in terms of international, in terms of communications technology, has produced no change in the number of writers, bloggers, journalists in prison. It's still around 850. We keep the gold standard list. That doesn't mean there are only 850. It means it's the list that we've got and we can work with that everybody else uses. All the other organizations use. It hasn't gone down. It goes up 800 to 900. The big new change under the regime of this new communications, I'm not blaming it, I'm just saying, is that there had been a decline in the killing of writers, to which bloggers are part, right? And that in the last 10 years, the killing of writers is just taking off like mad. So somewhere between over 200 writers are killed every year now, which was not the case if you went back. They used to be put in prison, there'd be false trials, but it's much easier and faster just to kill them. And you don't have long discussions about it. The other thing that's interesting is that there's no relationship between the sophistication of the society and the sophistication of the use of the technology, communications technology. So a place like Ethiopia, 90 million people, poverty-stricken, has one of the most sophisticated security control systems in the world. Depends on where you put your money. So ethics comes not from technology, it comes from people, it comes from citizens. They may be organized nationally. If they're not organized nationally, it's pretty hard to organize it regionally or internationally. And again, what you're seeing today is how much the new technology people abandoned the national fight and left a vacuum which has been occupied by the people you know, and I'm not just talking about the United States. I mean, let's remember that, for example, the interjection of security forces in the United States into the last presidential election at a key moment was preceded 2 elections ago by a similar event in Canada, and it is interesting, even though I detest the right-wing candidate, not the extreme right-wing candidate, the right-wing candidate in France, it is interesting that the legal/security system has chosen exactly the moment of the election to intervene, on whose behalf we don't even know. So this is this idea of winning the national battle for ethics as applied to communications technology is absolutely essential because people actually live somewhere. Most people live somewhere. You and I belong to a tiny minority who move around, and I would argue that statistically speaking, fewer people are moving seriously around the world today than during the height of the European empires in the late 19th, early 20th century. I've done some numbers, there are no serious numbers, but I would think that numbers today are much, much less than they were under the British, French, Dutch, etc. Empires. So what do we need? We need extremely clear laws linked to an ethical base. There are things like the Penn Declaration on Digital Freedom, which is a minimal attempt at something which is quite interesting if you want to look at it. But my point is that these laws can be enforced. The argument that the technology of communications is going so fast they can't be enforced is simply not true. There was a moment during which people said because of new technology you can't regulate the money markets anymore. They suddenly discovered that it had never been easier to regulate the money markets at the national, regional, and international level because of the technology. This is two-sided because, of course, if the dictatorship, it has the opposite effect. But in terms of democracy's ability to do something, it's never been so easy to regulate things. The same thing is true about offshore financial systems and the capacity of human beings to stop themselves from doing evil. Whatever the methodology, whether it's what's happening to a great extent with communications technology now or in other areas, it's perfectly proved. I mean, we decided we would not have nuclear wars. There were a few outliers, but essentially decisions were made. We decided more or less that we would not use poisonous gas in warfare. There are some exceptions, but they're outliers. We can make decisions to shape things, and then we have to fight to make that work. To believe that we can't shape things is to become curiously not modern, but passive. In other words, to believe that the technology is not shapeable is, in fact, even if you think of yourself as being on the left, is actually to become a shadow of the neoconservative globalist movement that says that nothing is shapeable, everything is determined by markets, whether they're technological or interest-based. What follows from this is a very interesting situation, which is that the basis of democracy or citizen-based societies, which may not be Western democracies. I'm not making a Western argument. As a former president of Penn, you learn, to look at each society in their own way. The whole idea was that citizens would increasingly have certain rights of which privacy, in the largest sense, would be central. And governments, on the other hand, and private corporations would be increasingly transparent. That's the structure of what you might call humanist democracy, soft dictatorships, whatever you want to call them, soft monarchies. That authority becomes increasingly transparent, and the citizen has the right to increasing privacy. And I'm glad to see that a serious civil servant is nodding. And so what has happened in the period of this massive revolution in communications is a complete inversion of this, that government, private corporations, and security have never had such an ability to go into the private lives of citizens and make private citizens' lives transparent to them. And on the other hand, governments and private corporations and security have probably in the modern era never been so secret. And I could do some really funny numbers, but I just don't remember them. But I mean, for example, the United States actually keeps good statistics, which most of the other countries don't. There's some independent groups that do statistics. And if I remember rightly, in the early 90s, the United States created 5 million new secrets a year. I mean, I'm doing this in a gross way. About 5 million new secrets a year, which is really a joke, right? I mean, what could they possibly be? Since we could go out and build a nuclear bomb, what are 5 million secrets? It's power grabbing by people. That's all it is. It's a way of grabbing power. Today, the United States, I believe the number creates 52 million new secrets every year. It's an astonishing situation, which we've never seen anything like this. How can you talk about a democracy functioning if the government creates 52 million secrets a year, because that means you can't make anything function. In a sense, you're seeing just the outer layers of the dysfunctionality of democracies today and the inability of democracies to go on big ideas, because everything's blocked at lower levels because of this rise in the use secrecy. And all of this is intentional. This is done on purpose. And the recent leaks, which one could discuss, the big leak systems, I think are a perfectly natural outcome, whether you like it or not, of this inverting of who's transparent and who's opaque and who's secret. So let me just finish by saying that I think what a lot of this has done is draw people more and more into an obsession with the details of the technology and of the information. It's not very original what I'm saying. And this society, certainly in terms of humanism, is in the last 100 years, the society which is the most passive and the least able to actually think about big ideas and how to change things for the better. There were enormous changes made in the late 19th century, many of them for the better. Enormous changes made in the late 30s through to about 1960, many of them for the better. And for the last 40 years, society in terms of humanism has been blocked, and those of us who are humanists and believe in an ethical approach towards society have not been so weak and passive in terms of big changes, big ideas. You could say the early idea of the EU was one of the last big leaps, and what's happened to it is in a way this good, but a lot of the negative of what's happened is part of this breaking down of the big idea. So, and tied to all of that has been I take two small details. One of them is, that every time I use the internet as a research tool, I'm a writer, the internet edits who I am and what I want and gives me back information which is increasingly chosen by the invisible machinery. And you say, well, you can always fight against that. You can, but you see there's a fundamental difference because in the 19th century, in the first half of the 20th century, newspapers, everybody knew what a newspaper stood for. You actually knew you were reading a liberal paper or a conservative paper or whatever. Whereas a lot of people, and that's what we're seeing today, actually believe that they have access to an international system which is in some way neutral, and that they're getting neutral information, whereas in fact they're getting information which is as edited as reading a liberal or conservative or right-wing or racist paper in the 1930s. But most people don't actually realize that. And then a second tiny little story, the Charlie Hebdo, which of course Penn was, very complex to deal with. But one of the things that was never said during the Charlie Hebdo debates after the murders was this incredible contradiction, which was that humor is a very particular human characteristic, and it is deeply provincial. It's often a part of a city, or it's a city, it's Chicago, or it's East End of London, and you go to the West End of London and people say, well, was that funny, right? So humor is regional, it's provincial, it might be national, but suddenly because of the technology, it's also international. And so I'm not making any judgments, I'm just saying that you have to, these kind of contradictions are really, really interesting when you're trying to think about what's happening. Where are we going? How do we deal with this stuff? I'm not saying, of course, we stood up against the murders, 100%. But there's that contradiction of there is local culture, there is national culture, and it's totally different from other cultures. So all of that to say, I think we're in the early days of a reawakening of the reality that this is a political battle in which people who believe in democracy or humanism or empathy are going to have to throw themselves very sharply into a battle to shape technology the way we shaped nuclear weapons or other pieces of technology to ensure that they are not used to destroy the well-being of citizens. That doesn't mean a limitation of freedom of expression. It means trying to reestablish that old balance, which is now in totally inverted imbalance of who gets the transparency and who gets the privacy. Thanks.
Wow. That was a fantastic starting point for us. That really was an excellent argument, John.
Now I can put my notes away.
I mean, so just pulling some themes out from that, technology is not inherently ethical. doesn't inherently embed values. It is ignoring that reality has allowed the inversion of some key dynamics of a properly functioning society, power dynamics of a properly functioning society, who is transparent to whom, who controls whom. You've argued that the technology can be controlled and that we must commit ourselves to do so in order to vindicate those values. So, Mariam, can I start with you? Do you accept those principles? In other words, you're an expert in the dark side of this technology as much as anybody in this room. You train people on digital security, among other things. Is that the way the technology feels to you? It's not inherently good or bad, or maybe it is inherently bad or inherently good?
I think that, it's difficult to say that anything is black or white. When we're looking at the different forms of technology that we have these days and what it's being used for, whether it's being used by civil society or governments, it can be used for both good and bad. And we've seen this especially with social media. When we, as activists, when we use social media, we use it for documentation, we use it for raising awareness and so on, campaigning. But we've also seen how governments can use social media to harass, to defame, and to target people. So there's always a pro and con to any tool that's out there. So I don't think we can say that anything is inherently good or inherently bad. I think that one of the things that we really need to address is the gap that exists between the tech community and the human rights community. And I think that that's one of the spaces that's lacking, where we're seeing it being more bridged now, but it hasn't been for a long time. And I think that, the tech community does a great job in trying to think of what does the human rights community need and trying to develop those tools for the human rights community. But unfortunately, there isn't that direct conversation or dialogue between the tech community and the human rights community for the tech community to actually understand the needs of the people on the ground, the grassroots activists. And I think that that's one of the main things that's missing. But if I can also just respond to two of the points that were made. One of them is, there's a huge problem with the double standards of freedom of expression when we're talking about freedom of expression. And I love that you brought up the example of Charlie Hebdo, because that's something that's been brought up time and time again in the conversation about where do you put limits on freedom of expression, and if you do, where do you put those limits, right? And the question is, when you look at Charlie Hebdo, for example, when someone drew a caricature of the same cover that Charlie Hebdo had of the Muslim Brotherhood with bullets going through the Quran, hitting them, after more than 800 people had been massacred in Egypt, someone drew that same caricature after the Charlie Hebdo shooting, picturing a Charlie Hebdo cartoonist holding up the Charlie Hebdo magazine with bullets going through and saying, your magazine won't protect you. Now that person was arrested. And yet Charlie Hebdo, what they did was seen as freedom of expression.
Arrested by whom?
By the French authorities. And so I think that there's a huge question mark about who does freedom of expression work for? And why is it that it works for some people and not others? Why is it that when we look at freedom of expression in spaces like Charlie Hebdo or even on online expression, we don't take the context into consideration? When we have publications like Charlie Hebdo that targets a minority that's already under attack, not just in France, but around Europe, we need to look at whether that actually incites violence, whether that actually incites hatred against those minority groups. And so I think those questions need to be asked. And then the last point I'm going to make again as well is, you were talking about the issue of fighting for democracy, about the people who need to rise up and fight for democracy. And I think the main question in that again is democracy for whom? Because we see time and time again, if you're a citizen of Europe, there are different levels of citizenry, right? I'm a European citizen, but I'm also Muslim, I'm also a woman, and I'm also a person of color, which means that I don't belong in the same field of citizenry as a white Dane does in Europe. And it also means that my access to certain spaces is more limited than other Europeans who don't look like me. And that it also applies to free speech, because I have to sit in Denmark, for example, and hear politicians go on TV, and we've had politicians in Denmark say things like, Muslims should be kicked out or they should be turned into slaves or whatever it is, and to be said on public TV. And yet, on the other hand, people who are looking at material coming in from the Middle East that is deemed to be sympathetic to ISIS are immediately picked up and put behind bars because, that's propaganda for ISIS. Now, I'm not saying that one should be limited or the other should not be limited. I'm saying that there needs to be a real discussion about who these democracies work for and where we need to fight and, talk about where these exceptions are made And how do we go about making sure that democracy works for all of us, whether we're citizens or refugees or immigrants?
Let me pull a little bit on your first point, the first of those two that you called out. So the Charlie Hebdo case and the questions about the sort of the power dynamics around what we call freedom of expression, right? The way in which power relationships can be embedded and give expression and given expression on the internet. So for a good long chunk of my life, my model of the internet was that it was inherently good and inherently positive because it placed the power to speak globally into the hands of everybody. That was what I thought. And I spent years at Google endlessly defending the idea of non-responsibility, that the platform itself, because it allowed people to speak, was fundamentally a good thing and that our job was to defend it against censors. So all the threat model was governments like China will try to censor speech, and so we must defend the platform and trust in the marketplace of ideas to sort out truth. And I have to say that I have reconsidered that point of view in the last couple of years. I don't have the same feeling about it anymore. I'm tired of rich companies claiming that they have no responsibility for what goes on. So Stephen, you work for a rich company that embodies a very pure view of freedom of expression and one that in many ways I admire. Nevertheless, it's become absolutely clear, I think, that Twitter is a place where harassment thrives, where hate speech finds a home, where communities of racism find purchase. And so can you defend that point of view at this point, or do you have a more a view that was more nuanced than the one I used to have back in the day?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the discussion so far. I think we have so many interesting topics, and I'll try to be succinct in my answers. This is a very, when we start to look at freedom of expression, especially the evolution of technology itself and the way we interact, like I see the power of Twitter as being this live, this public and this conversational platform where you can engage, where it's instantaneous. You go there and you instantly see and receive what's happening literally. But when we start looking at how do we evolve, how do we make that environment safer for our users, make it so that they are free and they feel free to speak, I think that's some of the issues that we're addressing now. And you see a lot of the changes on the platform start to show and start to lean towards how do we make the user feel more empowered to speak, to feel empowered, to feel that their voice will not be damaged or they will not be harassed in a certain way. And I think that is obviously a nuanced approach, and that these kind of policies are not done in an echo chamber, and it's not done in a vacuum. And I think this is where we rely a lot on our engagement with civil society and with our engagement with other stakeholders. And we have global networks where we bring together thought leaders to try to have these discussions. How do we reach the right balance, touch the right chords where we can continue to provide the service that and stay true to the freedoms and the ideals that we were based upon. This comes back to, I think, a lot of the points that have been made about technology inherently good or evil. The spirit of a lot of our products, if you, not just Twitter, but you look a lot across the board on a lot of the products that have come out in the recent years, it's in the spirit of good to bring people together and to bring the conversation to a global mass, to connect, to integrate, to publicize, to make people laugh. I think this is all part of the discussion. It's not just because we're at this pressing moment where we have to start addressing some of the tougher questions. It's not time to just back down. It's time to, okay, this is the next step. How do we go forward? But ensure that we reach that balance, reach that right tone, and ensure that everyone continues to have that protection, that voice, and those freedoms online. So there's a number of other points I would love to touch on. I think this idea of different levels of citizenship is also extremely interesting. I would love to hear your thoughts on how do you view different levels of digital citizenship? Does that also, do you feel that there's still that difference online where you don't have to be a certain person of a certain region or anything like that? Do you see that a lot different than how you are in the offline?
Or access,
Yeah,
or just simple access.
access, yeah.
You know, I mean,
Sorry to take the moderator role a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I
Let's
was
go. You,
actually.
you definitely managed to change the subject from me really pushing you on Twitter's ethical responsibility, but we are going to come back to that. But Mariam, I think let's
Yeah,
take it in
sure.
that direction.
Yeah, I think that, the issue of access has been one of the main topic points that's been, on the table for some time now, whether online or offline. And access to spaces, it's interesting when you talk about how the internet was seen as inherently a good thing and that it brought people together and it was a space where people could raise their voices. But if you look at the numbers of access, who actually has access to the internet? Who actually can go out and give their opinion? And who can do that without fear of being arrested or tortured and or killed when they do that? And I think that you'll see that there's a huge difference. I mean, I don't have the numbers. I don't know if any of you do. But from what I've seen and I've read in the past, the numbers of the people who are active on the internet usually are much lower in, in the Middle East, in certain places, and certain countries around the world, right? Than we have, for example, in the West. And so there is an issue with access to the internet, but also access to services and access to protection when you have access to those services. And so I think, yes, there's definitely a level of citizenry when we talk about the whole online issue. For example, as a Bahraini, one of the biggest concerns I had being a very active Twitter user was when a Saudi prince bought a huge number of shares in Twitter, right? And so for me, that was a huge security concern because I didn't know what that meant in regards to our information as Gulf activists being shared with the Saudi government. And so there are those issues that happen, and it especially depends on these governments and monarchies especially, who do have a lot of money and do spend a lot of money on acquiring spyware, on acquiring shares in the different companies so that they can maintain some sort of control on what happens, especially inside their own countries. So I think there's definitely that level in different forms, of course, but it exists both online and offline, for sure.
I mean, there's also just a simple question of many people simply don't have access at all. I mean, people say, well, why would you do a paper magazine? Let's do internet magazines. Yeah. Well, what about I don't know what, half the world that doesn't have access? They need paper magazines. And actually, it's far easier to avoid the police with a paper magazine than it is online. I mean, this is what's often forgotten, that you can move a book around a lot easier than you can, be on Twitter. And I just wanted, just so nobody misunderstands, because you asked the question, and you replied that there's no good or evil, or you can't make that choice, black and white. What I was saying was, there is no ethical content, it's what you make it. So we're in total agreement, it is neither good nor evil, it's what you make it. Entirely, it has no ethical content of its own. So that even, for example, well, I agree totally, and in fact, it's almost guaranteed in all charters of rights and bills of rights, the right to assemble. But, the Nazis assembled, good can assemble, evil can assemble. So it really is all about the ethical content. And the reason I told the story about humor being local versus the technology being international was precisely to raise the point that you raised, which is that you have to continually be putting yourself in the place of the people in question and not be by mistake talking as a European or a North American. I mean, I remember negotiating a couple of years ago, and I won't name the country because it was done behind the scenes, an LGBT protection agreement in a very strange dictatorship in Central Asia. And but it had to be done entirely in the context of that place. You couldn't, for 1 minute, walk in there and make a public speech in favor of LGBT rights, because that would have produced a mob which would have killed these people. So you had to actually say, where am I? What's going on? How does it work here? How do these people live? What do they want us? How can we help them from their point of view? And that's true whether you're a woman, whether it's LGBT, whether it's whatever it is. And you just have to continually ask the question and be sure that the question is not a question which was actually written in New York, Los Angeles, London, Berlin. It has to be written where it's happening.
If I can just make a quick point on that, I think beyond just the idea of how can we help, it's how do we hold ourselves accountable?
That's part of it.
As well. So when we have, because for example, in places like the Gulf or other places, we have governments acquiring spyware from EU countries. And so I think the question should not just be how do we provide the tools to help people in those countries, but how do we hold EU companies accountable for selling spyware to those governments, even in places where people don't necessarily have huge access to the internet, but are using it to identify dissidents or activists for arrest, for torture, and so on. And so I think that the buck also stops here when it comes to accountability, because that spyware mostly is being generated here in Europe, and there are no real mechanisms. I mean, we have the OECD complaint mechanism, but that's not more than a slap on the wrist, even when they do issue a decision. And so there needs to be some real accountability mechanisms that we can use here in Europe to hold companies accountable for selling that spyware that governments are using to go after people.
You could actually add to that that this is the newest version of the arms trade. That you don't sell a machine, you do sell a machine gun, but you don't just sell a machine gun, you also sell this kind of equipment, which is in effect the equivalent of selling weaponry to be used against people. And I just would add one thing to that, which is, you know, Interpol. I mean, Interpol is now structured in such a way that it can be used to, by countries to put the writers or activists they want up into the Interpol system as criminals, and then try to use the international policing system to try to get them. I mean, all of this is not really being talked about in a serious way. We're assuming this stuff works. And in fact, it's increasingly being inverted.
So let's, Paul, let's take the discussion to the kind of structural stuff. So Mariam and John have both identified an example of, you know, a failure of governmental policy, right? Like we permit surveillance systems to be sold to repressive regimes. Behind that is a democratic practice and a set of democratic institutions, ideally democratic anyway, that could make the right decision. Presumably they would make the right decision if they were functioning properly. Many ways, though, when we look around the politics of the West anyway, and I think it's probably true to point to other regions of the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in South Asia, East Asia, and so forth, where extremes are empowered, dialogue has taken a turn for the rancorous, and where we sort of feel the intensity of hatreds and sectional divisions and so forth much more than at least I feel like we used to. One explanation could be that economics is behind all of this, but another explanation might be that these communications technologies have not been marshaled in the right way, or the companies that operate them are not operating them in the right way, and so forth. I'm curious what's your take on that. You have spent much time wrangling with the big technology companies. You have a window onto the democratic politics of Western Europe. What's your take?
My take is that the digital is very important and becoming more and more important in our society, and therefore those who shape the digital in terms of the engineers, the software writers, but also the companies, they have a duty to look beyond just their users, because you only mentioned the users. They have a responsibility to society and to bring into the political process, but also into practiced ethics when working on the technology, what we need to stay societies where democracy reigns, where fundamental rights are respected, and where the rule of law works. So I, at this type of discussion, usually challenge the tech community in a number of ways. First of all, I think when we talk about the polarization, it has many reasons, and there's not a golden bullet. But one reason is the downfall of the quality press, which structures the debate in Western societies. And now I'm talking Western Europe, and I'm talking the US. This downfall... North America.
You have
North
two
America.
Canadians on
North
the panel.
America.
Keep it
Okay, right. And this downfall, of course, has to do something with the rise of tech platforms, which are advantaged in many ways by old law, which I think we need to look at. The advertising revenues are being drained. All the money now goes to 70–80% of the money which previously was available for the private financing of plurality of opinions structured by editors who discuss and who work on things thoroughly, who investigate, who exercise the force power as journalists in democracy, which we need. All this is, the money is floating away. It goes to Google, Facebook, Twitter. And the question is, what do these platforms actually give us back in democracy? And there I think the answer, we are a great platform, everybody can talk, and there's more talk than before, is not enough. I would think in looking beyond users, we need a critique of technology as we had it always in our societies. The environmental movement was a critique of technologies because it was too dirty, and today we need a critique of the internet and of the platforms, and we need to invest in this academically, and it must be the honor of everybody thinking about democracy, fundamental rights and rule of law and asking the question, cost benefit of these technologies and what do they actually bring us positively. And there I would say we are very much at the beginning. There's not much happening. There was an illusion of, oh, the internet is great. But I would say the time of innocence of the internet is over because, yes, there is a relationship between these platforms and the polarization in society, the echo chambers, the viral hate, the fake news. Of course, it's not all caused by the platforms, but the negativity and the powers which always existed in societies, which were thinking like this, which wanted this, they are being empowered. Now they can go viral. Now they have a much broader spread. On the other side, let's ask also, what's the positive contribution? For example, how much do digital technology actually bring people back into sustained engagement in democracy? The Arab Spring was a disappointment. It was a flash mob and finished. Occupy, flash mob and finished. So, you know, the initial optimism about the digital organization among activists being good for society, I have some doubt about it. And actually, you know, I am wondering about the empirics, whether people, about the reality of that people, you know, when they grow up in schools and so on, they learn on the internet this and that, they start engaging in dialogue, maybe on Twitter and so on, but will this lead them into sustained engagement in democracy? And I think that's a question, you know, where we also have to do a critique of technology, because there are some people who say, well, actually, it doesn't lead people into sustained engagement in democracy. It makes them only selectivists. I like this word, you know, I'm not an English native speaker, but selectivist being the people who think they are engaged, but they only press the like button. They don't pay membership dues, not to the NGO, not to a political party. They never go to a demonstration. They never meet with people in person and learn to self-organize in democracy. You know, they only sit before their screen and do this and that. So I think there are many ways in which we have to challenge the people who think that, you know, the technology is their thing, and also the technology itself, in terms of coming back to the big societal issues. And there I totally agree with what you said. You know, technology is great, but in the end, if we don't engage as technologists and also as the companies which drain the money from some essential functions which previously were function of democracy, if we don't engage in democracy positively, we will lose it, and we will find ourselves in a situation which many of us will not like.
So I'd like to at least reserve some time to talk about what we could do. So I think let's look forward. We could drill down into things that all of you said, but let's take a little bit of time and look forward. So let's assume that Paul is correct, that the technology has been disappointing from the perspective of democratic practice. You know, this sort of strength and resilience of our democratic institutions and the participatory draw that they have on citizens and residents. So if that's true, like, and if we take John's point that these technologies are subject to our the imposed will of their architects and operators, what can we do?
I think I'll just give one answer and then I'll be silent because I'm sure many others have good ideas. But I think everything which is happening on the internet is mediated. So I think as a contrast to what is mediated, it's all on the screen. The screen is between me and the other person. We need something which is in German you call it die neue Unmittelbarkeit, the new directness. We must have people coming together again, like here today, and try to agree on a resolution on which we vote together here in the room, and not only one day, but for years to work together politically, because that's what democracy is about. It's about sustained engagement and getting organized with other people. And my thesis is that Occupy and Arab Spring failed because technology created the illusion of getting something done together, but the human element of working sustained together and knowing each other was missing. So I think we have to relearn democracy, and we will probably have to accept that the internet and the technologies are not a golden bullet on democracy. On the contrary, they can be a risk.
Mariam, was the Arab Spring a flash mob?
I've been waiting to answer. First of all, I'm disappointed that you think it was a disappointment, because if we think about it, the Arab Spring, first of all, was mischaracterized in the West to be called the Arab Spring to begin with. The terminology that's used is incorrect, in my opinion, as being someone who's a part of the so-called Arab Spring. Because it wasn't all Arabs, first of all. We can't exclude the other people who were part of it. And I don't think that spring is the right terminology for it. It was revolutions for dignity. I think that's a much better characterization. The second thing is that it was also mischaracterized in the sense that also in the West, mainly by the press, was the idea that these revolutions were the revolutions of Twitter and Facebook. And they were not. These were the revolutions of the youth. Twitter and Facebook were tools that were used by the youth for the revolutions. And I think whether they had those tools or not, they would have had other tools to go out on the streets and to demand their dignity back from their dictatorships. I think what we need to be asking is, yes, I know the situation looks quite messy in the Middle East right now, but people are still struggling. I think it's amazingly admirable how people are still taking to the streets 6 years on after killings and torture and arrests, mass clampdowns, and mass surveillance and all of that, and especially at a time when the West has been enabling a lot of our dictatorships in the Middle East to survive and to continue doing what they're doing. And I think it's impressive that the Syrians, the minute that there is a weapon, an agreement where they stop shooting each other, people still take to the streets and have peaceful protests against Bashar al-Assad to this day. And in Bahrain, we have to this day people protesting. And I think the thing that we forget, because we've gotten used to living in a fast-paced age, that we expect everything to happen so fast. But if we ask ourselves, how long did Europe take until they got to democracy? How many revolutions did it take? How many people were killed? France had to go through a revolution and then a military dictatorship before they were able to ever get to a democracy. And how long did that take?
Multiple dictatorships, multiple.
Exactly. So why is it that we expect the Middle East to suddenly, after 6 years, to suddenly be a flourishing democracy for everyone? That's not going to happen. I think that, we need to give, and I think we need to stand, in awe of the activists who continue day after day to take to the streets even now, despite everything that's happening. On the other point, on your other question, I think on what we can do, where do we go from here? When we're talking about, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, I think one of the important questions to ask moving forward is who regulates what constitutes freedom of speech and what doesn't? If we look at Facebook, for example, they have decided that the upper body of a woman is not allowed. You can't see that. But the upper body of a man is fine. Why is it that that regulation has been made? On what basis, right?
Who should make that decision?
Well, that's the thing. That needs to be part of the question, is that what constitutes freedom of expression and what doesn't? Right now, it's internally decided upon. It's the same thing we've seen with Facebook shutting down, for example, pages of Palestinian activists because they didn't like what they were saying. So there is a problem of who is deciding what is allowed to be on these pages and what isn't. We've seen the same thing with Twitter, unfortunately, in regards to harassment.
Do you want to see Twitter take a more heavy editorial role with content? And if so, who would then oversee Twitter's exercise of that responsibility?
I'm advocating for the opposite. I think that it shouldn't be an internal decision of Facebook or Twitter of what constitutes free expression. I think that's something that needs to be regulated. Just like, we have an issue with There cannot be discrimination based on gender. There cannot be discrimination based on religion. There cannot be discrimination based on identity. We have to see those same things being applied on these platforms. Why is it that a woman's body is not allowed and a man's body is?
But presumably you wouldn't want the Bahraini government to be making that regulation for Bahrain, right?
Definitely not. I think it needs to be according to international standards.
Okay.
So this
John.
is where, you know, I mean, this is the, sorry, I don't want to.
No, please.
I mean, this is what, you know, in a sense, we're all saying the same thing, which is that, you know, these are wonderful breakthroughs technologically, but in fact, until you have people in a room or in rooms organized in some way according, you can't put laws in place. Almost all the solutions to these problems fit into international agreements, traditional international agreements on human rights, and national agreements on human rights, the serious ones. I mean, all those protections are already there. They're just not being applied. We haven't figured out how to apply them to the internet. But they're being, on the other hand, they are being, the opposite kind of rules are being applied by dictatorships. So the dictatorships are getting to apply old-fashioned authoritarian rules, whereas the democracies are not applying, and when I say democracies in the broadest sense, are not applying even the international agreements on human rights. So there's a real breakdown because of this sort of passivity. And just one important detail in all of this is we spent about 100 years coming up with rules around the world to do with not having monopolies and oligopolies. Right? The United States actually still has some pretty good rules on that, but there are all sorts of ideas that you must not allow monopolies and oligopolies in the steel industry or in the newspaper industry. And one of the outcomes of globalization was that while nobody was noticing, because we were all talking about trade and fighting trade, that actually those rules were basically dropped. So the result is today that the newspapers are, you know, you go country by country and often internationally in very, very few hands. All the old rules of competing freedom of expression have been abandoned, and nobody's even thought about how it applies to the internet, to get competing opinions in there. I mean, I'm a great user of Twitter. I actually think that one of the interesting things about Twitter is that if people trust you, you can be like the editor-in-chief of your own newspaper, you know, if they trust you. So it's actually a very interesting tool, but we haven't actually worked out the serious issues of how this stuff fits into things we spent 100 years putting in place and fought a lot of wars to put in place. And those wars led to deep, deep injustice, for example, in the Middle East, which we still have not come back to deal with those deep, deep injustices, and so we're still in the middle of it, and I think you explained it absolutely right. But we have to look very seriously at what are the basic ethical principles and how do they apply to the internet? Or how can they be applied to the internet?
Stephen.
Yes. Again, now I'm getting so many issues on one time.
Well, let me just say, I used to be in your seat when I was at Google, and what we could do is we can call it like Schmitter and not actually talk about your company, but we could talk about Facebook or
It's not a problem.
some other platform.
I just want to make sure I respond in the right way. I think I want to come back to maybe one of the points that John made initially around the ethics and the national identity of ethics. And I think you touched upon this as well in your response right now, is how do we talk about freedom of expression after hundreds of years of developing it in our liberal societies when we're still fighting a lot of wars and people are fighting and activists are fighting to understand their own freedom of expression, their own ideals, their own ethics on how to express themselves within their own societies. I think that plays into the global nature of how do we define our approach to freedom of expression as a global company, and how do we engage more with local actors to ensure that we reach that right balance and we find where we can get to a point that we, again, ensure that our users are also protected, but because we're also public and you don't have to be logged on to Twitter, that the public is also understanding of how the platform works and how they can engage and how that expression is also digested externally. Because I think coming to, Paul, you had a lot of points and I'll try to get through some of them, but coming to this idea of publishers and media and the way that we conceive either the globalization of media or the populism around media being too let's say, too absorbed or too saturated, maybe, if that's kind of where I'm getting at, that you're arguing for that we need more of this offline, tangible, local approach to ensuring that there's a justification, there's some truth, there's some honesty behind media, where you feel that this is kind of being lacking because of the saturation of the online space. And mentioning fake news is...
Can I press you on something? Let me try a
Certainly.
version of that here and just see. So, Paul's alluded to this point, but I'll say it in my own words, which is we now have such an incredible diversity of voices and speakers, and the institutional repositories of authority and trust that we used to have because they adhered to ethically committed principles of, two sources for a fact, for example, in a newspaper. So we live in a world of much more cacophony and much weaker institutions that we might trust. Twitter, in one sense, is just an endless stream of real-time tweets from people that I choose to follow. On the other hand, Twitter has also started pulling 10 tweets a day out for me and trying to elevate them to the top of my feed and show me what I missed. Does Twitter have an ethical responsibility to make sure that those 10 tweets are either true or authoritative or broadly indicative of the social conversation that I need to be a part of if our democracy is to function?
No, that's a good question. I think this is more of based on your engagement on Twitter as well. But when you're talking about how you respond to somebody or how you find a certain trust in somebody on Twitter, like we do have certain measures to verify certain individuals, publications, award-winning journalists, and I think we have voices that kind of elevate that discussion a little bit further. And that
So do you accept that you have a responsibility to try to write algorithms that will use signals that will make our democracy better?
I think there's again, coming back to some of my previous points, I think we are engaging more and more to find how we reach that balance. I think this is where we're having the discussion at this.
So it's a live discussion at Twitter.
It's a live discussion.
Let me ask any of the panelists though, does Twitter, I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot because I used to say, I used to argue that Google's search algorithm was 100% mathematical and neutral, and it was just a function of the link structure of the internet and so forth. But it's clear that that's not true. It's clear that there are value judgments embedded in the math. And so one of the things which I think is a challenge to the technology world is, because I agree with you that we can make these tools do more evil or less evil. You can protect privacy more or less. You can make somebody's identity easier to find or harder to find. Many different values that are embedded in that. And I've personally gotten to the point where I can no longer really defend that position of neutrality. I think if you're running a search engine or a social network or a speech platform, you have to accept that out of the thousands of things that you could be putting in front of your readers, you need to think carefully about which ones go to the top of that stack. And
editing, in the old sense of the word.
Yeah,
editing.
I mean, like, it is a form of editorial selection. Facebook, I think I'm a heavy Facebook user. I have probably, I don't know, let's say 3,000 friends. That means that on any given day, there's probably 1,000 posts that I could see in my news feed, and I will probably see 20. And so Facebook thinks very carefully about which 20 posts should go in front. Some of it's driven by business dynamics. If they've got a new photo product, they'll probably put more photos in front of me. If they've got a new news partnership, maybe there'll be news stories. One of those two things is more important for the health of democracy than the other. And, absent a global governance mechanism, we are still stuck with companies that traverse national borders and have a headquarters in one country, staff in some number of countries. And so a regulatory solution is pretty far off, I say. Maybe when, the world of, multiplanetary governance and Star Trek like Federation of Planets exists. But in the meantime, these companies are on the front lines of making these decisions with ethical implications.
I think the two practical things. One is that the reality is those people who are making those decisions live somewhere. And I think it's really Miriam's point. They live somewhere. And they think they're making an editorial decision based on standards, it's the standards of their civilization. And they have to say that, so that if I want to read the New York Times in Europe, it says the New York Times in Europe. And I know what I'm reading. If I read Le Monde, I know what I'm reading. And that editorial decision, which is so opaque in the internet, who's making these decisions? What culture do they belong to when they make those decisions? That's the basis of, when you talk about responsibility and freedom of expression, it's who are these people? What culture are they coming from, and what is the structure of these attitudes? It's not borderless. It is not global. And the other just tiny point I want to make is, which is gigantic, which is we say democracy. But in fact, there are lots of other civilizations in the world that are not Western democracies. I mean, there is a tradition in China, the Mandate of Heaven, which is fundamentally about the citizen's right to overthrow the king, or the Communist Party, and Confucius, of whom there are two interpretations. One of them is the interpretation of power, and the other is the interpretation of a humanist view of freedom of expression, decency, and justice in China. And we have to be so careful that this Western idea of democracy, China has a very interesting tradition of open debate. It just happens they have a government that's pretending that that isn't the case.
But the question,
and we're letting them get away with that, and beating up people and putting people in jail.
But the question to the tech
Chinese,
community,
it's a kind of Chinese.
But the question to the tech community: do you take responsibility for your impacts in democracy? That's what you're raising this question. I think it's a very important question, and I think we're just at the beginning of the tech community taking ownership of this question, because I think you're absolutely right. So far, the mantra is, these platforms are neutral, they're passive, and if you compare it to newspapers where you have people who think about what's on top of the page not because of the earnings model, because that's what they are thinking about, of course, to optimize the earnings of Twitter and Facebook, but because of what's important tomorrow in our democracy. This type of people,
or in our society.
Yeah, but I speak for Europe, so I'd like to emphasize the point of democracy. These type of people and this type of thinking and this type of ethos, that it's not only about the earnings model, but it is actually about journalistic quality and what is relevant in society, not to the individual, what they want to see, but relevant in society also. I think this type of taking responsibility, even beyond people who see yours, you always talk either about your users or the people who look at Twitter, but you have to realize that if there is hate speech on your website, when people on Twitter gang up and say, let's get the baseball bats to teach these migrants a lesson, you have an impact in society beyond people who look at your site. Because people will be affected who have nothing to do with Twitter. They will be beaten up because through Twitter, not engaging, for example, sufficiently on incitement to violence, you have created a cost and a problem in society. Yeah? And so I think, this type of engagement towards the general interest and democracy beyond the earning model, the stock exchange model, I think is key for the tech society, because tech companies, and what you are saying is basically, these guys should become utilities. Because as long as they are private companies, you can have a great discussion about freedom of speech or not. I mean, private companies, they do, and they have the right to do what they want. If you want to have a real discussion about what they should be doing in terms of freedom of speech or responsibility not to spread violence, or also not to cede to dictators here and there, we have to have a discussion whether the monopoly, if it is one, or the oligopoly, if it is one, must be treated like a utility and maybe also must be treated like press. And I think that is the interesting debate to have.
And can I add just one thing to that? Sorry, which is, so in about 1926, John Galsworthy, English Nobel Prize, wrote the first charter of PEN. And it's been rewritten slightly ever since by these really interesting people. And it is incredibly short and contradictory. On the one hand, a total belief in unlimited freedom of expression. On the other hand, an obligation not to encourage hatred between people. And this is exactly, it's about unlimited freedom of expression, but a professional and ethical responsibility not to create war, not to create hatred, not to create racism. And that's the editor's job, that's the writer's job, and that's you have to be identified and take that responsibility.
Stephen. And then, by the way, just we're almost out of time. So, Stephen, I'm going to allow you to get in sort of like the last substantive word, and then I'd like everybody to have kind of like a final thought, maybe one thing at the top of your list of something to do to better realize the potential of these technologies. But, Stephen, you should respond.
I'll try to be succinct. I feel like the approach that you're taking here is that the online community is living in an echo chamber itself. We see Twitter really as a reflection of society. It's a window to the events that are taking place. It's not, hate doesn't just exist online. It is a reflection of individuals offline and the issues that are currently happening in real life. Events happen and there's reactions. And some of those reactions are negative, but a lot of those reactions are positive. A lot of what we see of the highest engagements on Twitter are positive messaging. When there's a positive event, more people engage than when there's a negative one. And when there's a negative event, more people engage to even counter that narrative. It's not always a horrible outcome, and it's not always this dark area where no positive voices exist. I think when we're looking going forward, how do we balance a lot of the personal freedoms? Of course, I think there has to be more engagement from civil society. We're open to continuously hear from voices from across the sectors. There's excellent activists who are experts in a lot of areas where we may not have that expertise, and we look and we want to engage further with that. And I think that's where we bring the discourse further. On how this can be done, when we look at regulating liability, we're looking at it from a very Western liberal democracy standpoint, but seeing what's happening even in Europe on how the approach to online intervention liabilities, if this is the standard of where we're going, how is that set for other countries, third-party countries that are much different, have a much different approach and have traditionally been pushed a little bit further back or have been encouraged for internet communities to kind of push further back against them. So I think this is where we have to take that next step. And then for our standpoint, we are continuously trying to build on our transparency and be more open to make sure that everyone's informed of our updates. Constantly check out our transparency report. We just launched one last week. It's got a lot of new updates in there as well. So I think this is one of the areas as well. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I think, Paul, you and I have found an area of agreement. We have debated each other occasionally on large issues and small, but an area where I am in full agreement with you is that we are now at the beginning stages of technology companies accepting responsibility for the effects of their platforms on society. I think that is just true, and I think it's good. I think the conundrum, though, that Stephen points out is that all of these old arguments remain true, which is to say, we don't have a single governance authority that can decide what is appropriate and what's not. We don't want these technology platforms to be subject to the most oppressive, the most restrictive, the most culturally specific government and its preferences, or culture and its preferences. And so accepting responsibility doesn't necessarily mean suddenly folding, because it is the case that folding, just suddenly saying like, okay, we will control the flow of information and decide what's good and what's bad, that would be bad. So let's go down and just have everybody offer a closing thought maybe, and we'll end basically on time. Stephen, why don't you start?
From our side, I think there's a lot to still discuss, and I agree that we're still at a turning point of where we take the next step and how do we further engage. And I think I welcome more feedback and I welcome more engagement, and happy to take this conversation offline with anybody here as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
I think, moving forward, I agree with Stephen. There needs to be, like I said earlier, a more consistent, continuous discussion between the tech community and the human rights community on what is needed moving forward. I also think that we need to hold, when we talk about freedom of expression and tech companies and so on, we need to have higher standards than what we've set for everyday journalism right now, because I think that there is a problem with selectivity on what is considered to be free expression and not, and who it relates to. So I think there needs to be an actual discussion on the ethics of journalism as we have it today, because there's a problem with it, and moving forward. And then I think the third thing, even if it's really difficult right now, you mentioned this earlier, it's really difficult right now to have a standard agreement on what is free expression or how that should be within, tech companies, like whether it's social media or otherwise. I think one of the things that we can provide now is mechanisms for accountability. And so when tech companies, for example, refuse to respond to harassment, when they refuse to respond to threats, when they are shutting people down because they don't like what they're saying, and so infringing on their right to free expression and so on, there needs to be mechanisms for accountability. And I don't mean accountability in the sense of one individual going against a multi-million-dollar company so that there's absolutely no chance that they can win, but mechanisms that actually work for the individual to protect individual rights when it comes to free expression as well.
I think we need a differentiated debate. The challenges which are posed for freedom of speech are completely different, whether we are talking about a situation in countries where you have dictatorships on the one hand, or countries where you normally have a good level of freedom of speech, but you have specific issues like incitement to violence and so on. And I would say the argument that the internet must be one and we can only have one set of business rules and so on because it's most efficient for the stock exchange, I don't think it can prime over the argument that we here in Europe, we make our laws, and Twitter, Google, Facebook, they have to comply with our laws, whatever it means for their earning models. And I am not convinced that it's a good argument to say, if you make a law on hate speech, then in Bahrain, China, and Turkey, they will also make laws on hate speech, but these laws will be abusive and they will suppress what really should be free speech. Because if one thinks this argument to the end, in the democracy, we can never make a law anymore. Because whatever law we make, this law will be taken by a dictatorship somewhere else in the world and they will make an abusive version of it. And so I think, that is a little bit a too simplistic approach to try to put tech models, the internet is one, our business model must be global, we cannot take account of the local and regional specificities over democracy. I think that goes a little bit too far. I think democracy must still prime, and even global companies which wish, for reasons of profitability, a global business model like Google, Facebook, and Twitter, they must accept our laws and apply them. And if it means that for Europe they have to tweak things a little bit differently than for elsewhere in the world, that is right that they do it. And we will hold them to it. Because only this way we can actually respond to what you are saying to create accountability. Because accountability mechanisms, they are defined by laws which are normally still made in democracies. And that means national law must prime.
So, what's so interesting about this conversation is that we've come such a long way because nobody's throwing anything at us, at least not yet. And so 10 years ago, a conversation like this, if we'd said some of this stuff, we would have had things thrown at us because we were going against the great dream. And we're just, I think people said, we're just in the very early stages of how to do this. And what you've just said is exactly right, which is that struggles for freedom of expression happen in different times, in different places, in different ways, unless you believe in a single model. And so there are places where you can, in Europe, you can apply certain things. You still have some problems, like Hungary, and right, some real problems. And you go through the Western democracies, you find real problems. But then other places are at a different place in terms of the fight, and I think what you said about the time, why should this have been done in 3 months? We haven't even fixed Sykes-Picot, right? So why would it be all fixed in 3 months? It's really, really complicated stuff, and that's why I raised the question of China. There are actually really interesting humanist options inside China. We're just playing along with a regime that pretends that those things never existed, and they say anything that's humanist is Western. That is a complete ignorance. I remember writing a letter to the president of China, which I'm sure he didn't read, but pointing out that he was in betrayal of an enormous humanist tradition in China. So the last comment I want to make is, and what I really loved about this conversation is, it's the first time I've taken part in a conversation of internet people where everybody basically agreed that the way this will work is everybody will go back to a very old-fashioned thing, which is physical human beings taking a lot of time to make things work, which is the exact opposite of what was said 10 years ago. and say Richard Rorty, who is the great atypical American philosopher who died a few years ago, his last book you should really read, because it's really about the betrayal of the modern liberal class, which is what you saw in the last election there, not refusing the idea that the way societies function is that people are willing to go in and bore themselves to death and ruin their lives over the long term to have good education and fair rules and decent societies. This doesn't happen. I love Twitter, but it doesn't happen with a tweet. It doesn't happen with a speech. It happens with this endless kind of work, you know, taking control of school boards, taking control of this, staying there, being there. It's the exact opposite of the Harvard model. Just sit in Harvard and wait for somebody to pay you a lot of money in Washington, you know? So it's a really interesting discussion, I thought, today. So it was worth coming from the Arctic for it.
So thank you very much to the panelists. I'll just say my concluding thought is, Paul, I'm so glad you threw down another marker that I can argue with now, because great, I don't agree with you about whether all companies have to just do special things for Europe. And that's because I think American democracy is fundamentally broken. I think our institutions are not working well. They're not representative. I think the same is true in Europe. And I think that one of the crises of the West right now is that we have to fix democratic institutions so that when Europe does produce a decision, it's one that I would feel comfortable saying, yes, we will do it just because it's the product of a democratic system. Anyway, we have only barely begun to, and I'm totally with you on how we're going to get there. It's not going to be people tweeting more and better stuff. It's going to be a rejuvenation of democratic practice, which is fundamentally relationships of people who know each other. So on that note, thank you all for sticking around and staying past the conclusion. Thank you very much to the panelists. On to the drinks.